For 700 years, they had been gathered from the ships that docked in the harbor of Alexandria, from the courts of eastern kings, from the libraries of Athens and Babylon and Carthage. Every scroll that entered the port was taken, copied, and returned. The originals stayed. The Ptolemaic kings had built something the world had never seen before and would not see again. It was a room large enough to hold everything humanity had ever written down. The cedar shelves held the geometry of Pythagoras, the star charts of Chaldea, the tragedies of Aeschylus, the anatomical observations of men who had cut open the human body and written down what they found. Decades of labor, compressed into dried papyrus and careful ink, stacked in the dark. In November of 48 BC, a Roman general stood at a marble column overlooking the harbor. He raised his right hand. He lowered 2 fingers. Then, the wind shifted. What is the true price of survival when a single command can alter human history? In 48 BC, Julius Caesar stood trapped in Alexandria, vastly outnumbered and watching the harbor slip from his grasp. Tens of thousands of raging Alexandrians closed in, turning the marble labyrinth of the city into a suffocating death trap for the Roman legions. To secure his maritime lifeline, Caesar gave a cold, calculated order: incinerate the enemy fleet before it could sail. But as the Mediterranean wind unexpectedly shifted, the flames leapt from the warships to the sprawling storehouses of the great library. Did the fire that forged the Roman Empire intentionally sacrifice the greatest intellectual treasure of the ancient world? To comprehend what was lost, we must first witness what was built. Alexandria, in the autumn of 48 BC, stood as the apex of human civilization. It was a sprawling metropolis of white limestone, perfect grid streets, and staggering wealth, built on the bones of Alexander the Great's ambition. The Ptolemaic capital was a monument to Greek intellect and Egyptian opulence. Colonnades of Aswan granite lined the Canopic Way. The Great Soma, the tomb of Alexander, rested in the city's heart. The winds that swept off the Mediterranean carried the scent of salt, impending storms. The Roman Republic, groaning under the weight of its own immense power, was violently birthing an empire. The epicenter of this seismic shift had moved from the dusty plains of Pharsalus to the golden shores of Egypt. Julius Caesar arrived in the magnificent city of Alexandria. He was a conqueror, trailing the ghosts of a shattered republic and the fresh blood of his rival Pompey the Great. The ancient land of the pharaohs was tearing itself apart. It was caught in a venomous power struggle between the young, fiercely ambitious Ptolemy XIII and his brilliant, exiled sister, Cleopatra VII. Caesar marched his forces directly into this opulent royal palace complex. He sought to act as the ultimate arbiter. Yet, he grossly underestimated the volatile nature of the Alexandrian populace and the vast resources of the Egyptian state. He brought with him approximately 4,000 legionaries. 4,000 men. Against the vast, sprawling metropolis of Alexandria, this was a precariously fragile number. It was a force large enough to provoke the Egyptian state, yet entirely insufficient to subdue it. Men hardened by the grueling campaigns of Gaul found themselves rapidly enveloped. The vast avenues and monumental architecture of the Ptolemaic capital, designed to inspire awe, now formed a terrifying labyrinth. By November, the tension shattered into open warfare. The trap was sprung by Achilles, the cunning and ruthless commander of the Egyptian forces. He marched upon the Roman positions with a staggering host of 20,000 heavily armed soldiers. This was not a battle of open plains. It was a suffocating urban siege. The Romans find themselves trapped within the Bruchion quarter, barricaded behind the marble columns of the royal precinct. The magnificent palace was transformed into a besieged fortress. The siege was a claustrophobic nightmare. The Mediterranean sun beat against the limestone facades of the royal quarter. Heat radiated from the paving stones, distorting the air above the streets. Dust drifted across the Roman barricades, settling on the iron rims of the scuta. Beyond the timber palisades, the city convulsed. The Roman legionaries stood in tight formation. Sweat carved paths through the grime on their faces, pulling at their collarbones beneath the chainmail. They conserved their spit. Their breathing was rhythmic. Outside the walls, the Alexandrian mob hurled paving stones, broken statuary, and iron darts. The projectiles struck the timber defenses with flat thuds. Splinters rained down on the helmets of the vanguard. The impacts echoed through the empty marble corridors, bouncing off the mosaics of forgotten kings. The Roman historical accounts speak with a mixture of disdain and anxiety about the Alexandrina multitudo, the Alexandrian crowd. They were fiercely independent, volatile, and intimately familiar with the labyrinthine alleys, the subterranean cisterns, and the rooftops. The famed Roman military machine was a disciplined organism fighting for the most primal of strategic lifelines. It was forced into a claustrophobic, three-dimensional war against a civilian resistance that utilized the very architecture of Alexandria as a weapon. The geographical reality tightened the noose. Caesar observed the perimeter from the steps of the theater. He wore a standard officer's cloak, stained with salt and dust. He calculated the remaining grain and assessed the water levels. 3,000 men held a fraction of a sprawling metropolis against tens of thousands. Achilles blockaded the Romans by land, sealing the avenues, and then moved to cut them off by sea. The enemy held the streets and the high ground. To the south, the marshlands of Lake Mareotis offered nothing but disease and an impassable quagmire. To the north, the great harbor lay under the glare of the afternoon sun. Moored along the stone quays sat 72 Ptolemaic warships. They were vessels fitted with bronze rams, masts, and rigging, their hulls painted with the eyes of Horus, swaying gently in the tide. This was not merely a collection of wood and sail. It represented the absolute maritime supremacy of the Eastern Mediterranean. If Ganymedes and the Alexandrian forces breached the docks and manned those vessels, the sea would close. The Romans would become an isolated island inside a hostile continent. The maritime lifeline was the only tether connecting Caesar to the might of Rome. Losing the fleet meant losing the harbor. Losing the harbor meant starvation. It was a mathematical certainty. A drastic decision was necessitated by the unforgiving calculus of war. Caesar did not pace. He did not issue rallying speeches. His logic was cold, precise, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. He realized he had to destroy the Egyptian fleet before it could be deployed. He could not afford to capture the ships. He lacked the men and the time. There was only one weapon fast enough: fire. In his meticulous records, the Commentary de Bello Civili, he stripped the event of any dramatic flourish. He stated simply that military necessity dictated the destruction of the enemy vessels to prevent total annihilation. He stood by a marble column, his eyes tracking the enemy forces clustering near the shipyard. He raised his right hand. He lowered 2 fingers. The centurions turned. The orders rippled in low tones. Men broke from the defensive line with practiced economy, moving toward supply carts. They hoisted amphorae of pitch and woven baskets of raw sulfur. A cohort formed a wedge formation, their hobnailed sandals grinding against the basalt pavement in a steady metallic crunch. The mob surged forward. Javelins rained down from roofs. Wooden shafts splintered against the overlapping shields of the testudo. A spear pierced a legionnaire's thigh. The man fell. The rank closed instantly. The march did not break stride. They reached the edge of the wharf. The legionaries stripped their heavy armor. They carried clay pots of boiling pitch, tightly bound bundles of dry papyrus reeds, and blazing torches. They formed a wedge of muscle and steel, fighting their way down the sloping streets to the waterfront. They pierced the Egyptian lines. They reached the wooden docks. They hurled the clay pots onto the decks of the massive Egyptian warships. The pots shattered. The thick, black pitch spread over the dry cedar planks. They dropped the torches. Fire catches with predatory speed in the dry Mediterranean wind. The pitch ignited with a concussive roar, sending a shockwave of heat across the water. The flames leapt from rigging to rigging, consuming the resin-soaked timber of the quinqueremes. The harbor erupted into a spectacular, terrifying cauldron of light. The dry timber, sealed with pitch and tar, caught instantly. Ultimately, 110 ships, representing the naval pride of the Ptolemaic kingdom, were reduced to groaning, snapping infernos. The heat pushed outward, a physical wall forcing the Roman vanguard to step back half a pace. Bronze rams hissed as water turned to steam. Timber cracked with the percussive sound of artillery. Burning masts crashed into the water. Egyptian dockworkers rushed the piers with leather buckets of seawater, running directly into the heat zone. Roman archers adjusted their aim. Strings snapped forward. Dockworkers fell, blood pooling on sun-baked stone and instantly turning brown in the heat. Spilled water evaporated before reaching the edge. The tactical objective was achieved. Then, the wind shifted. December brought a biting, unpredictable wind off the Mediterranean. A sudden shift in atmospheric pressure altered the gale, catching the flames and bending them southward. The fire leapt the gap between the doomed vessels and the stone docks. It gnawed at wooden pilings, swallowing towering wooden cranes, rope spools, and stacks of imported cedar. The Romans held their ground. They watched the inferno expand. A legionnaire drank a measured mouthful from his waterskin. The heat blistered the red paint on his shield. He did not move his feet. What began as a calculated military strike mutated into a tragedy of incomprehensible proportions. The fire climbed the sloping streets, feeding on awnings, wooden carts, and merchant stalls. It swept relentlessly toward the Bruchion quarter, the heart of cultural grandeur, reaching the massive warehouses lining the waterfront. These structures lacked the marble columns of the royal quarters. They were built of heavy stone blocks and timber beams, packed with the wealth of the Ptolemaic trade. Grain silos ignited. Compressed wheat dust exploded, blowing roofs off stone cylinders. Plumes of black smoke pumped into the sky. The sweet smell of roasting grain mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Among these structures were the Apothekai. The historian Cassius Dio, analyzing the archives centuries later, is careful with his terminology. He notes that it was the Apothekai, commercial storehouses containing grain and books, that caught fire. It is here that history, archaeology, and myth violently collide. The ancient Greek word bibliotheki can refer to a grand institution of learning, but it can equally mean a simple bookcase or a storage room. Adjacent to the grain stores stood the sprawling annexes of the Mausian. At that time, the Ptolemaic dynasty possessed a profound obsession with knowledge. They searched every ship entering the port of Alexandria, and unconditionally confiscated any books they found. History refers to these as the books from the ships. It was precisely here, in the port's Apothekai, that these confiscated books were temporarily stockpiled in massive quantities. They were compared with the originals and transcribed. These buildings housed the overflow of the Great Library. They contained tens of thousands of freshly acquired papyrus scrolls, confiscated from incoming ships, or vast collections bound for export. They rested on miles of cedar shelves. The knowledge of Babylon, the tragedies of Athens, the star charts of Chaldea, the anatomical treatises of Herophilus, the geometric proofs of Pythagoras. As the fire consumes the dockside, it engulfs these massive warehouses. The fire breached the roof. Clay tiles shattered under thermal stress, raining sharp shrapnel. Weakened wooden rafters collapsed inward, crushing cedar shelves. The flames touched the papyrus. The dried papyrus had been waiting at the docks, thousands of scrolls in transit. They had been copied in the libraries and workshops of the Mausian. They were destined for export to Rome, to Athens, to the courts of Eastern kings who paid well for Alexandria's intellectual production. It took mere seconds for centuries of accumulated human intellect to convert into kinetic energy. The scrolls detonated. The words of Aeschylus turned to ash. The astronomical observations of Aristarchus dissolved into glowing embers. Millions of hours of observation, calculation, and philosophy vanished into the rising thermal column. The fire did not discriminate between accounting records and philosophy. The meticulous catalogues of Callimachus, the Pinaques, which had taken decades to compile, ignited and turned to black flakes in a fraction of a second. The scale of this loss immediately becomes a battlefield of numbers. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, writing decades later in his treatise De Tranquillitate Animi, uses the disaster not as a strict historical ledger, but as a moral warning. Seneca, quoting Livy, whose account was contemporary with the events, numbers the scrolls at 40,000. He records the destruction of 40,000 books, citing it as an ultimate proof of the vanity of excessive possession. Centuries later, authors like Aulus Gellius will inflate this number to a staggering 700,000 volumes. Plutarch, writing of the conqueror's life in the 2nd century after Christ, having visited Alexandria himself and stood in the places where these events occurred, records the result in a single clause of a longer sentence. He noted with quiet devastation that the fire, originally intended only for the dockyards, raged out of control and ultimately destroyed the great library, consuming the minds of the past in a mindless blaze. The Mausian, the scholars said later, continued to function. Callimachus had spent decades compiling it, a catalogue of every scroll in the collection, organized by subject, by author, by city of origin. Title, opening line, number of columns, name of the copyist. 120 volumes of meticulous inventory, covering everything the library held. If a scroll existed, it was in the Penates. Strabo visited it, decades after, and found men still working. The shelves were not empty. Scholars would find an entry. They would read the title, the author, the opening line. They would walk to the section, locate the shelf, and run their fingers along the remaining scrolls. Didymus Chalcenterus, the most prolific commentator in the ancient world, produced his enormous output from Alexandria in the years immediately following. This implies that whatever he needed to produce it was still accessible. Ptolemy II had assembled the systematic collection of every text in the known world. The library had sent agents to every ship that docked in the harbor, with orders to borrow whatever the passengers carried. They copied it, returned the copy with thanks, and kept the original. Whether all of that had survived, or had only partially survived, or had survived in some form that the scholars who came after could still use, the record cannot say. Modern perspectives offer a nuanced, though no less tragic, interpretation of the ashes. The Mausian itself, located deeper within the city, likely escapes the flames. It was the shrine of the Muses, and the architectural heart of the great library. It is heavily suspected by later scholars, analyzing the city's geography, that the Inferno may not have consumed the central museum itself, but rather the massive, sprawling warehouses situated near the docks. These storehouses were vital transit points. They were bursting with tens of thousands of freshly acquired papyrus scrolls, waiting to be catalogued, or vast collections prepared for export across the Mediterranean. Regardless of whether it was the main library or its massive commercial annexes, the loss was absolute. While the fire consumed the harbor and the intellect of antiquity, Caesar launched a lightning amphibious assault. He loaded a heavily armed detachment into small, flat-bottomed skiffs. He ordered them rowed directly through the burning wreckage of the Egyptian fleet. Their target was the Pharos. The Pharos of Alexandria stood at the northeastern tip of Pharos Island, where the island's rocky end looked out over the open Mediterranean. 400 feet of marble and limestone, built 2.5 centuries earlier on the orders of Ptolemy II. It rose in 3 tiers, square at the base, octagonal in the middle, and cylindrical at the crown. It was topped by a great mirror of polished bronze that reflected a light visible 35 miles at sea. One of the 7 wonders of the world. The sailors of the eastern Mediterranean had been steering by its light for generations. They ran it into the horizon from Cyprus and Crete and the Libyan coast, letting the bronze gleam resolve out of the sea haze. It was the first confirmation that they had correctly navigated to Alexandria, and had not fetched up on the sandbars of the Nile Delta. Underwater masonry excavated near modern Cape Bay Fort confirms its staggering dimensions and the strategic nightmare of capturing it. Recognizing that controlling the harbor meant nothing if the enemy controlled its gate, Caesar ordered a desperate assault on the Pharos. The Roman boats slammed into the jagged, rocky shore of the Pharos island. The legionaries spilled out, their heavy rectangular shields raised instantly against a hail of arrows from the island's Ptolemaic garrison. The fighting here regressed to primitive savagery. They fought on the slippery, algae-covered rocks, grappling hand to hand with the defenders. The Romans formed the testudo, an impenetrable shell of overlapping shields. They battered their way up the causeway known as the Heptastadion, severing the island's connection to the mainland. The battle for the base of the lighthouse was a vertical siege. Romans drove their short swords upward into the vulnerable joints of the defenders' armor. Bodies fell from the lower defensive tiers of the great tower, crashing onto the rocks below with sickening impacts. Blood mingled with the white sea foam. Caesar himself stood in the prow of one of the skiffs, directly overseeing the assault. He remained completely exposed to sniper fire, his distinct red consular cloak a prime target for every archer on the island. He remained entirely motionless. The psychological weapon deployed was absolute. The Roman dictator demonstrated zero fear. He established a reality where Roman victory was an undeniable law of nature. The Ptolemaic garrison broke. The Romans surged forward, securing the base of the Pharos and the surrounding docks. They controlled the harbor entrance. The lifeline was secured. The siege grinds on into the early weeks of 47 BC. Survival dictated controlling the Heptastadion, the massive earthen causeway linking the mainland to the island of the lighthouse. This was the massive causeway that connected the mainland of the city to the island of the lighthouse. The detachment marched into a narrow strip of land, exposed to churning water on both sides. The Egyptian garrison locked shields and lowered spears. The clash was devoid of pageantry. Zero cover. Roman archers laid suppression fire. Egyptian defenders hurled lead bullets that dented helmets and shattered collarbones. A legionnaire took a bullet to the face. The man behind stepped over the body. It was an industrial grinding of men and metal. Thrust beneath the rim of the shield. Twist the blade. Recover. Step forward. The Egyptian line buckled on blood-slicked stones, men falling backward into the dark Mediterranean, turning it a pale, frothy crimson. But the victory was fleeting. Enraged, Egyptian forces launched a massive, coordinated counterattack across the causeway. The slaughterhouse fractured Roman discipline. Panic set in. Retreat devolved into chaos. Soldiers were pushed into the sea. In the shadow of the great lighthouse, the commander of the Roman forces realizes the bridge is lost. The boats are sinking under the weight of fleeing soldiers. There is no strategy left, no tactical brilliance to deploy. The general sheds his heavy crimson cloak. He held the dispatches above the surface with one hand. He swam with the other. He plunges into the freezing, turbulent waters of the harbor. He swims frantically toward a distant Roman galley, dragging himself from the sea. He gasps for breath, entirely stripped of his imperial dignity. He reached his ships. The dispatches were wet, but readable. The Alexandrian War is a story defined by a profound and tragic paradox. The cold, calculating military logic that Caesar employed, the ruthless decision to ignite the fleet, was undeniably successful in its primary objective. The flames kept the harbor open, allowing the besieged Romans to breathe just long enough for crucial reinforcements to arrive. Later historians would look back at the ashes of the docklands and mourn the loss of the great library, conflating the destruction of the commercial Apothekai with the annihilation of all human knowledge. The physical evidence, the lack of a definitive, city-wide burnt layer dating to this specific year in the archaeological record, supports the assertion that the core of the library survived to see another day. However, the scars remained. The fire that ensured the birth of the Roman Empire simultaneously eradicated a massive portion of the world's intellectual heritage. The sea crashed against the rocks of the Pharos, the tide washing the fresh blood from the stone. The waves pulled back, rhythmic and unchanged, entirely indifferent to the empire being forged on the causeway, and entirely indifferent to the centuries of history that had just burned to dust. The smoke covered the stars. Somewhere in the Mausian, the Pinates still existed. The Pinates listed more than the shelves held. Sometimes the scroll was there. Sometimes it was not. Whether it had burned in the Apothekai, or simply never been copied, or survived somewhere uncatalogued in a private collection in Athens or Pergamum, the record could not say. The entry remained. Some scrolls did not.